Now on record, before I start, I want to find out if I'm audible enough. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, that's good. So now let's shoot it off. We have come a long way this semester, and we are done with our coursework. I'm looking at the schedule of work in your course outline or the course syllabus. And this is a summary of all we have done. Um, so let me start by sharing my screen. What I have here is our course syllabus, and this is the schedule and plan of work, the work we just completed in our last class. And so we're just looking at it again in a summarized way. We, for our first and second weeks, or rather for our first class, we reviewed the course outline. We distinguished types of sentence-shaped thought. We recognized sentence fragments, emotive expressions. We identified different types of declaratives. We contrasted facts and values. We even saw different types of values. That's the moral and non-moral values, value judgments, you know. And so this is the slide we had used. We saw interrogative sentences, sentences you utter to solicit information. And then we saw imperatives, which you generate in order to get someone to do something. We saw declaratives, sentences that provide information, and we said there are three of them, or rather four. We have factual statements, value judgments, definitions, and arguments. We saw factual statements, statements you can verify with facts. We saw definitions, statements that provide meaning. And then we saw value judgments, statements that reflect what people think that the world should look like, you know. And we saw two types of them. We saw moral and non-moral. Then we saw the emotive expressions, the sentence fragments. And then in the second week, the second class, we had looked at definitions. I think I have definitions here. Okay, so this is the slide we had used on definitions. Sentences that convey information. We distinguish between definiendum and definiens. We said definiendum is like the subject, the definiens is like the predicate. We saw types of definitions. We saw lexical or dictionary definitions. We saw ostensive, the ones you can't write down, definitions that are best, that can only be demonstrated, but not spoken or written. And then the theoretical ones, definitions that originate from various academic disciplines. You saw stipulative definitions you can formulate at a particular moment for a particular purpose. So operational definitions, definitions that definitions that outline a kind of procedure or operation. And then we saw essential definitions, which we said are the only accurate kinds of definitions. Every other kinds of definitions, apart from essential definitions, are inaccurate. Okay, we saw problems with definitions such as too broad, a definition that captures, that captures items in the world that go beyond what is needed to define the definiendum. Such a definition is too broad. We saw too narrow definitions whose definiens does not capture the sufficient items that are needed to define the definiendum. Then we saw vague definitions, we saw ambiguous definitions, and then we saw secularity, definitions where the definiens repeats the definiendum. Begging the question, we said the definitions whose definiens is obscure or digresses from providing meaning, or does not even help in shedding meaning on the definiendum. And then from there, in the third class, we went on to discussing types of discourses and verbal disputes. Let me see. I have my discourses slides here. What is a discourse? We said it's a passage. We saw both arguments and non-arguments. Argument, a passage that contains a conclusion and premise. We saw examples. We saw how arguments can be identified, and then we moved on to non-arguments. We saw narratives, instructional passages, rhetorical polemic. For rhetorical polemic, we had said it's a passage communicating a usually strong feeling. We tried to distinguish it from argument by saying that rhetorical polemic can also contain claims, just like arguments, but in addition to claims, they would contain emotive expressions. Then we saw verbal and real disputes. We saw the verbal disputes you can resolve that are resolved by going for the correct meaning of something. Or if something does not have a clear meaning at all, then the verbal dispute is permanent, unless you can find an accurate meaning. Then we saw the real disputes are different from verbal disputes. They are disputes about facts or about people's beliefs and preferences, And when we were done with that, we went to discussing what was that? The senses of law. That's the normative and the empirical. I think I have it here. Yeah, the normative and empirical. We also distinguished facts and values, but we noted that sometimes we can mistake values for facts. We can see factual statements with just a single word that converts them from factual statements to value judgments. We saw examples, and then we went on to metaphors and proverbs. And we had said metaphors are statements that shouldn't be interpreted literally. We saw examples. Then we saw proverbs, which we said perform multiple purposes. Proverbs are literal statements. They have literal meaning. They also have non-literal meaning. We saw examples, and many of you can provide examples. Then we went on to look at meaning defects in language. We saw vagueness, expressions that have no boundaries of application. We saw ambiguity, expressions that are capable of more than one meaning. We saw referential ambiguity, that's ambiguous words, or what you call them, homographs. Then we saw syntactic or sentential ambiguity, when a sentence itself is ambiguous, even though the individual words may be clear. Then we saw the difference between vagueness and ambiguity. We said vagueness means no clear boundary of meaning, but ambiguity means that the meaning is clear, but it's more than one. There could be two or three clear meanings. Then we saw equivocation, which we saw in our last class. We have equivocation we have non-argumentative equivocation. That's the ones we saw here. These ones are non-argumentative. You can equivocate in a joke whilst cracking a joke and those things, or whilst just making a casual statement. It was when we were studying informal fallacies that we saw how equivocation can be done in an argument. when we saw an example about someone opposing the struggle for women for gender equality. Okay, so that one was an argumentative equivocation, but these examples of equivocation here are non-argumentative. They are just equivocation committed in a casual way, you know. Okay. And then we said to find an equivocation, you have to find out, first of all, if a passage contains a word more than once. And then the next thing you ask yourself, if that word has different meanings, the way it occurred in the passage. Then we saw the senses of law. We saw natural laws, civil laws, cultural norms, customary law, moral, logical, mathematical laws, divine laws. And from there, we went to deductive reasoning. For deductive reasoning, we saw the different forms of reasoning, deductive and inductive. We looked at the details of deductive reasoning, reference and attribute classes, you know, finite and infinite reference classes, universal and particular statements. We saw the issue of validity, and then we compared it to inductive argument. You know. Then we saw how the hidden conditional works in a deductive argument. We saw how to write deductive arguments in symbols, even the inductive ones, and also how to write them in conditional ways or forms. You know, we saw the deductive rule, which is that we only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. And from there, we said arguments that affirm the antecedent are valid modus ponens. The ones that deny the antecedent are invalid fallacies of denying the antecedents. And then arguments that affirm the consequent are invalid, but the ones that deny the consequent are valid modus tollens. We saw the whole thing with both graphs and words and symbols. And from there, we went on to hypothetical syllogism. For hypothetical syllogism, we saw how it works. The consequent of a particular premise would be the antecedent of the next premise. And we saw two hypothetical fallacies. Then we saw the disjunctive syllogism, and from there we looked at validity versus soundness. What does it take for an argument to be valid? And what does it take for an argument to be both valid and sound? So then from there, we went to inductive arguments. For inductive reasoning, we said the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not logical. We saw verifiable and confirmable statements. We saw how they are combined to form an inductive argument. And we were saying that inductive arguments are used mostly in sciences. We saw two ways of detecting confirmable statements, and we said confirmable statements are normally the conclusions of inductive arguments. They are also called hypotheses, and we have both law-like and statistical hypotheses. Those are the two major kinds of conclusions of inductive arguments. And we used the finite and infinite reference classes to be able to distinguish between law-like and statistical hypotheses. We say the law-like hypotheses are those inductive conclusions with that are universal statements. And then the statistical hypotheses are those inductive conclusions that are actually particular statements. We saw that inductive arguments are not as strong as deductive arguments. And we said confirmation is not proof. You know. And so we took a trip to see how inductive arguments play out when they either have law-like hypothesis as conclusion or when they have statistical hypothesis as conclusions. Then we saw the nature of inductive arguments. We say they are extrapolations. We saw the different kinds of extrapolations. We saw generalization, statistical syllogisms, analogies, predictions. Then we looked at the two kinds of inductive arguments. We saw those ending with law-like hypothesis as conclusions. And then we saw those ending with statistical hypothesis as conclusions. And we were saying that those that end with statistical hypothesis as conclusions are a little bit safer to advance or propose compared to the ones that end with law-like hypothesis as conclusions. And then that was it for inductive reasoning. And then in the next class, we did causal reasoning. We saw different senses of the word cause. We saw proximate, contributory cause, necessary, sufficient cause. We saw probabilistic cause, causal agent, causal chain, and web. You know. And then we looked at the three kinds of informal causal reasoning patterns. 3 out of 5, because John Stuart Mill had actually proposed 5. We said relevant reasoning is to identify something that is happening, that is occurring differently in an environment, and then ask yourself if it is the cause of a problem in the environment. Then we saw causal common thread, which is to identify something that is common to all cases of a particular problem. We saw concomitant variation, which is to discover a problem by measuring something in the environment, not by its presence or absence, but by its degree or intensity. Then we saw causal fallacies. We saw post hoc, ego propter hoc, the tendency to assume that something that happens before another may have caused it. We saw non-causal, pro-causal, exchanging cause with effect. You know, this happened before this, and then you say, no, it is the other one that happened before the other one. Then we saw oversimplified cause, not being able to identify the causes of something, all the causes of something. And then we have false common thread, common threads that are not the case. Then we saw confusing correlation with causation. And we saw slippery slope, which is to argue basically out of exaggeration, saying that something will lead to something more serious and another thing that is more serious and so on. And then we went over to the class we had last, where we saw other kinds of fallacies. We saw, we saw equivocation in argument. We saw secularity in argument. The difference between now, so this is equivocation, which we did before, but in our last class, we were seeing how it works in argument. We also said secularity in argument as different from secularity in definition. Then we saw grandstanding, appealing to majority. We saw ad hominem, attacking people or praising people instead of supporting or rejecting their arguments. That's a positive and negative ad hominem. And then we saw illegitimate appeal to authority, referring to people's qualifications or qualifications or proficiency professional expertise to, justify their positions. And then we saw genetic fallacy, judging the value of something according to where it came from. And we're talking about where it came from in terms of either geography or time or context. Then we saw appeal to threat, appeal to pity. We saw the three fallacies of manipulating the data. We saw misplaced vividness, where you use a few vivid examples to deny, where you use a few vivid examples of the contrary to deny a general problem. We saw the fallacy of semi-attached figures, where you use statistics that don't quite fit a conclusion to try to support the conclusion. Then we saw hasty generalization, where you judge an entire population based on a few samples, and that was it. So now we're done with the entire retinue of coursework. Now it is time to take your questions. Anyone who has any questions can advance it so that we address it. And when we're done, we'll also post this video to the recording of this class to your site so that others can also benefit from any questions that might have been asked. I'm also confident that the course was delivered clearly and with some degree of accuracy. So it might also be the reason why the questions are not too many. All right, Israel Tete.
Sir, good morning. Sir, my question is not regarding, it's not about the course, it's about the IE, the assessment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, please, the assessment, the problem I had was, I was trying to submit anything I tried to submit, the question restarts again. And I did mine around 3 p.m. So at first I thought it wasn't a problem. And so in the evening, one of my friends came and told me that the grade is supposed to appear. So then I realized that the thing is not submitting. Like when I answered them, they like it's not submitting as it should. So I'm appealing to you, so I do something for us.
Yeah. Have you seen the announcement I sent yesterday to your Sakai platform?
Say please, I saw it too.
Okay.
And I was like,
yeah. So having noted that one, we'll see what we'll do about the assessments in general. You are going to get your IA by Monday next week. After the IA, we'll think about what to do about those who could not do their various assessments.
okay, thank you, sir.
All right. Okay, so let me see. So please, you can forget about your assessments because I will think about what can be done. But that will be after your IA, which is coming up next week, Monday next week. The same next week, we'll think about what to do about all the assessments, to take care of anyone who feels he didn't get a chance to perform. Daniel.
Sir, good morning.
Yeah, good morning.
Sir, please, with my assignment one, it has disappeared. Like the result has disappeared. It's only the assignment 2 that's displayed there.
Did you have a result in assignment 1 before it disappeared?
No, please.
So why are you saying it disappeared?
It's first it was showing, but there was no result there.
When
But
it
when the
was
assignment,
okay, when it was showing, what was it?
it hasn't been graded by them.
Yeah, so you are repeating what many other people have asked.
Oh, okay.
Are you not aware that it is being graded?
So I'm aware.
So why are you complaining it is not there? Did you expect the person grading it to grade all of them overnight?
No, please.
Okay, so the person is grading quite a good number of people. And of course, the person is a human being and needs time to get the whole thing done.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yes, then anyone else raising their hand? Naomi, do you have something to say?
Yes, so good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Naomi.
Please, after you sent the email concerning the fact that it has not been graded, that's why it's 0. Students kept complaining, they kept asking, even though we kept telling them on Sakai and WhatsApp. So I have hidden the assignments, one from them till everyone's phone is graded. And I've actually told them this, but I don't know why they keep asking the same question. So that's the reason why they can't see their assignments one. It's been hidden from them till it's done grading.
Okay, that's good. Is it possible that any of them has 0, or that the person who is complaining probably has 0,
Sir, I've not had anyone who had 0 yet.
Okay, that's good. That's good. So you have all heard from your tutor that your assignments have been graded, So unless you went there again and then you, maybe by some negative miracle, you still didn't see something or something. All right. So I presume that problem has been dealt with. Was it King Harry was raising his hand? He has brought down his hand again. Okay, that's fine. So please prepare for your IA on Monday. The IA is going to cover everything we've done, especially those areas that were not covered in your first 2 assignments. So, all right. Now I'm going to end the class and I'm going to post the video to Sakai. And since this is our last meeting, I hope we shall be crossing paths later on in life. And I encourage you to keep working hard so that you contribute to the economy of the country and the continent. Live responsible lives, obey all the moral principles. Make sure you don't join those who participate in corruption as you get older in your life. All right. So goodbye.
Goodbye, sir.
Goodbye, sir.
Goodbye, sir.